You have followed India and Pakistan tensions and their bilateral relations and their conflicts for ages. Did anything in this last episode really surprise you?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the crisis and indeed the conflict itself was not that much of a surprise because we have seen a pattern in recent years where there's an attack, a terrorist attack in India, which India blames on Pakistan, and then you have Indian military action, which has become a crisis and a conflict. We saw this in 2019. Of course, in 2016, India launched some surgical strikes in Pakistan after there was an attack in India. What we have seen looking from 2016 to 2019 to this most recent crisis is that the level of force, the level of conventional force used by both countries has grown. So in that sense, it was not a surprise that we had this very dangerous crisis and conflict, and that it escalated. But what was surprising to me was how quickly it escalated. And I think looking back on it, looking back on this very brief conflict between India and Pakistan, it's the closest that the two countries have come to going to war since 1999. And indeed, the level of hostilities and the intensity of hostilities between the two, in my view, was the most we've seen between India and Pakistan since the 71 war.
Exactly. How important is this, especially when their CDS, Anil Chauhan, in recent security conference at Shangri-La, he confessed, rather he admitted that they had suffered from some losses, and we believe in Pakistan that we managed to shot down their 6 planes, including 4 Rafale. How important is this factor in this conflict?
Well, it's very important, and there's been a lot of observers that have asked why did India not make that acknowledgement sooner? Because there had been growing indications that Indian planes had been shot down, and you'd had several Western intelligence officials acknowledging this as well. So it's notable that it took this long for India to acknowledge it, and perhaps in a way that was not ideal for New Delhi, being asked about it in an interview with the international media. But this is very significant, and I think the fact is, I would argue that one of the reasons why Pakistan was able to claim victory in this conflict is this very fact that it had shot down several Indian jets. It's a significant achievement for the Pakistani military, and in that sense, I think it's something that is going to continue to feature in discussions about this conflict. Both sides have claimed victory, of course, but I think from the Pakistani perspective, it really enables Islamabad and Pakistan on the whole to push back against these narratives which come from India, but also elsewhere, that suggest that Pakistan is not able to hold its own against India because India has a larger and more powerful military. I mean, if anything, we've seen that Pakistan has been able to demonstrate that it is able to achieve a level of parity with India's military, particularly when it comes to how they stack up on the LOC. So absolutely, this is a very significant moment in the conflict. And of course, for India to formally acknowledge what happened, that's essentially to acknowledge this significant Indian loss, which has been something that Pakistan has been happy to point to as a significant achievement in this conflict.
All right, Michael, just before this very conflict, we have seen that the United States of America, they were almost least bothered about this conflict and about the heated up environment in the subcontinent in South Asia. But then we saw that even the Secretary Rubio or the President Trump, they were properly involved for the ceasefire, and they claimed that they managed to have this ceasefire. What enabled or what made Trump administration to intervene for ceasefire, despite the fact that they were least interested before this conflict?
Right. So I think that, I mean, there's a misconception out there that the U.S. really was not engaged on this issue and not concerned about it until the final hours. But I would argue that even though President Trump and Vice President Vance earlier on in the crisis were saying that it's not for the U.S. to get involved in, they need to figure it out themselves, and they will. The State Department was consistently and actively engaged. And Secretary of State Rubio, who really was the lead U.S. actor in terms of the U.S. response, he spoke with his counterparts in India and Pakistan several times before the ceasefire talks began. And it seemed like every day when there was a State Department press conference during the crisis, the State Department spokeswoman would say that something to the effect of the U.S. is not watching this from afar. We're engaged. We're focused on it. So in terms of what prompted the U.S. to actually start intensifying its engagement, because indeed it's one thing for the State Department to call for de-escalation and to talk to counterparts. It's something else completely to actually be pushing for a ceasefire. Honestly, I think it was nuclear escalation risks, and it's unclear to me what particular incident might have triggered these concerns on the part of the U.S. The New York Times, among other international media, indicated that the U.S. had received troubling intelligence. But I think that we could look perhaps to when India targeted the Noor Khan air base in Rawalpindi, which, as you well know, is a pretty significant sensitive site. So I think that, it's a pattern that we've seen in the past when the U.S. gets diplomatically involved in these India-Pakistan crises. It's when things escalate to the point that the U.S. Worries about the risk of nuclear escalation. So I think that's what prompted Secretary of State Rubio and later on Vice President Vance to become actively involved. I don't necessarily think President Trump himself was directly involved, even though he suggested he was. But I think it really comes down to those nuclear escalation risks that prompted the U.S. government to push up these efforts to get to a ceasefire. I do
Michael,
not think that. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, let me put it in easier words, in simple words for our audience at large. What I understand from your analysis, did nuclear signaling play an important role in de-escalation? Simple.
It's hard. I mean, there's so much that's unknown about this conflict. There's a very strong fog of war element. It's difficult to answer that question conclusively. The best I can say is that given that Pakistan, as I understand it, was publicly signaling its intention to convene the National Command Authority for a meeting, that could perhaps be seen as something that prompted the U.S. to become increasingly concerned. But again, there's a lot that we still don't know about what prompted the U.S., specifically what prompted the U.S. to ramp up its efforts toward a ceasefire.
So after President Trump's announcement for ceasefire, Indian media especially, and then their policymakers and their certain office bearers, they criticized heavily and they said, no, it was not the reason that we went for the ceasefire. They had some other ideas in their mind. Do you think that it is Indian media or their hardliners that is influencing the Indian government's policy making?